Hey everyone, I'm Rather Incoherent, and these are all the survivors of Arkham Horror laid out with their signature cards and weaknesses. Today I'm continuing my series where I've been going through class by class and analyzing all of the cards, trying as much as I can to do it in a vacuum without looking at their card pools and their stat lines. The point of this, of trying to analyze just what comes with the investigator, is I want to not just take a while to focus in really hard on what makes each investigator unique, but I also want to take a while trying to determine how strong I think these things are in a vacuum, because that'll let me see how much that ability strength is influenced by the final deck they end up in. I think Stella is a perfect example of what I talk about when I say that I'm trying to analyze how strong their abilities and signatures are versus how harsh their weaknesses and see how strong I think they are, to compare it to the reality in the game and see how much of their power is made up by their card pool versus their abilities versus their stat line. Because if you just look at Stella's abilities, they're probably the top abilities in the game. I don't think Stella is even close to being the best investigator in the game. She's very, very good, but I don't think she's anywhere near the top 5 investigators. And almost all of that is because of her mono red card pool, her stat line that is basically absolute trash without quick learner. But let's talk about these abilities, because these are ridiculous. These are the reason that Stella is what she is. Stella's investigator ability is a reaction, where after you fail a skill test, you just get an additional action this round. It's limit once per round, obviously, but that is completely crazy. Tony's got one of the strongest abilities we've seen so far, and his ability is just you get an extra action to fight. Stella realistically just gets an extra action to do whatever it is she's doing. Realistically, if you're taking 4 action turns like Tony is, you could probably expect one of your actions to fail from bad RNG. Which means that guaranteeing another skill after that fail test is pretty similar to just having an extra action. Where it gets better than having an extra action is when you look at all the things like Drawing Then, Take Card, and Rabbit's Foot, where you actually want to fail a test, and Quick Learner, where you're more likely to fail a test on your first skill check, and you convert this downside into pure upside. And I know I just named a bunch of specific cards, and we're not supposed to be doing that today, but benefiting from failure is a general thing that Survivor has. And even if I don't name the cards, I can still say Survivors probably don't mind failing a test too much. This is basically just a free action with upside. Her star effect is not the best. She already has 8/8 soak and relatively good defensive stats, so choosing to automatically fail the skill test to heal 1 damage in 1 horror isn't very good. It does help with those edge cases where you try to fail a test and you roll star and then your take card doesn't fire off and you don't get the action back. But most of the time in those circumstances, you still get a clue. It was still fine. It's not a star that does literally nothing, but it's very, very close to doing nothing. If you're trying to pass a test, it's blank, and if you're trying to fail a test, the star almost never mattered anyway. So I'd much rather just see something where it's +0 or even -1, and then some benefit for Stella, if the idea is that it lets you fail tests that you want to fail. I don't know. Stella's star feels very close to blank for me, and I'm having a hard time articulating why that is. Stella's ability, Neither Rain Nor Snow, is fucking insane, to put it bluntly. A 3 question mark skill is just generally pretty alright, but this one has the upside of if you're using it defensively, if the skill test fails, cancel all effects of the failed test. You commit this to a crypt shield, doesn't matter if you hit auto-fail, you're keeping all your assets. You commit this to any test, no matter how difficult it is from the Mythos phase, no matter what your stats are, you pass. That's absolutely crazy. That would be very good if she had 1 copy of it, but she gets 3 of them. For some inexplicable reason. I don't have a lot more to say about Neither Rain Nor Snow. It's essentially 3 skill versions of Word of Protection that can be used offensively if you're completely safe to the Mythos deck too. It's just nuts. Called by the Mist is irrelevant. It's a 2 action tax at worst, and the vast majority of the time, that's not a problem. Even if you are being forced to interact with it, where you're not able to get rid of it right now, and you have to be taking difficult tests that trigger its ability, you've got 8 base soak, you're a survivor, you're gonna be fine. It's not a big deal. Called by the Mist just does almost nothing. It's one of the softest weaknesses in the game. So where am I putting Stella Clark? That's the easiest top of S tier in my entire life. Stella Clark's ability is just absolutely insane. Her signature card, she gets 3 of it, and it's nuts. Her weakness doesn't do anything, and her elder sign might basically be blank, but everything else is so good about her that it doesn't matter at all, and the elder signs really are the least important part of a character anyway. Stella is, in my opinion, easily the best ability in the game. I'm very confident that she's better than any of the rogues or seekers or guardians we've already went through, and even though I put no real thought into the rest of the survivors or mystics before making this video, I think the only person that could possibly compete with her is going to be Gloria, and I'm pretty sure she beats Gloria too. She's just absolutely busted. What you get when you pick Stella is insane. The fact that you get a mono red card pool with 2 in book and 3 in fist, that's pretty terrible. That goes a long way to balance her out, but her abilities are just insane. Anyway, moving on to our next survivor, we have Bob Jenkins. I'm guessing based on the first line of his ability that it's technically against the rules for Table Talk to tell people what's in your hands. That's a little bit confusing to me since hidden cards specify that they can't be talked about. And like it's a very normal part of a cooperative card game to talk to each other about your hands and plan around what's in your hand. But that's fine because it's not part of his power level, it's just specifying that you're allowed to. The second part is his actual ability. He gets an additional action, but he can only use it to play item assets. However, they don't have to be his item assets, he can help his teammates pay for theirs as well. That is not that good. Like, don't get me wrong, your teammates will always appreciate having a Bob around. Your economy usually doesn't line up perfectly, and having someone to help you pay for your items helps a lot. But as I have said so many times, if your teammates built a deck that needs money from you, they built a bad deck. They should have built a deck with a better economy. You shouldn't be picking an investigator or a card to fix that. They should be fixing it. And his star is actually blank. It does nothing. I need to say it in each video, a star that only gives you positive numbers is irrelevant. Any test you're taking, you're expecting to fail if you're failing by like -5, so getting up to like +6 from this star doesn't matter. You aren't planning around it and it's not reliable. But all the tests you're choosing to take, you're going to pass at 0. So if your star is just like +0 to 6 or +2 or whatever, that's irrelevant. Who cares? It doesn't matter. Bob Jenkins is living in a very similar world to Minty Fan, where his signature asset is actually the reason you play him, and the stuff on his character card is kind of trash. Shrewd Dealings is a 2-cost talent asset that reduces the cost of every item you play by 1. That's a lot of economy. It's helpful, but it's not that relevant. But the big one is that when you play an item asset, you can put it under the control of any investigator at your location. Shrewd Dealings is single-handedly making Bob one of the better healers in the game. It lets you do things like spend your free action each turn playing leather coats underneath your teammates or whatever soak item you have. You're going to have to cooperate with your team a little bit when it comes to deck building, make sure that you're getting items that don't take up slots they need to help soak for them, but that's really valuable. Again, the fact that this helps you pay for stuff your team is playing doesn't interest me at all. It's fine, but I don't care. There's also some niche stuff where Bob can buy big green guns and then give them to his fighter. Again, if your fighter needs you to buy a gun for him, your fighter messed up. The main thing Shrewd Dealings does is it lets Bob play out assets to soak for his team. There are a couple of other cards that are not assets, things like maybe you can give a lucky cigarette case to a seeker that's not using their next slot. But the main benefit of Shrewd Dealings is not handing out weird specific cards, it's handing out soak. His weakness says you better be playing big money green. You're always taking 1 horror, but if you have 0 resources, you take 4, 5 you take 3, and 10 you take 2. You really want to be walking around with at least 6 resources at all times on Bob Jenkins. Greed is definitely a scary weakness, but with 8 base horror soak, access to level 0 red cards and green 1 to 5, you should be able to find a way to soak that horror. It's really not that scary. So where do I rate Bob Jenkins? Do I put him in fine? Like, I think Bob is a much better investigator than I'm ranking him right now. But his character card does nothing. His star does nothing. His ability does nothing. His weakness doesn't do much, so that's nice, and his signature asset lets him do things that no other character can by playing out soak as a form of proactive healing and just mitigating the incoming damage instead. If his ability were printed on him instead of his signature asset, I might be putting him in S tier, because then he could do it throughout the whole game reliably. But because he has to find the asset first, instead of having this completely unique playstyle that no one else is allowed to use, you're kind of locked into a high draw, big money style deck. Otherwise, you're not even going to find the signature asset, which is the reason you're playing Bob. I think I'm going to put him in good, just like I did with Mentee Fan. The problem with that, though, is that his ability isn't as good as Mentee Fan's. Analytical Mind is much better than Shrewd Dealings. I really don't want to put Bob in Fine, but I'm going to. His ability in Shrewd Dealings is so good, but red-green isn't like the highest draw deck in the world, especially in the first half of the campaign when you only have a couple of green cards. So yeah, as much as I want to place Bob higher than this, because I know as an investigator he is a much better than this, it's not because of the stuff he comes with, it's because of the deck you build and the team you have. It kills me to do that to Bob. Let's come down to Silas, though. It's really hard for me to look at Silas's ability and tell you about it in a vacuum. I can tell you this, it's a lot worse in a vacuum because we're not going to be talking about Unrelenting. I think his ability is quite good in a vacuum. It lets you do a lot of things more reliably. You can use Overpower to pretend you have a base stat of 6 once per round. You can do things like throw Guts or Unexpected Courage at a test that it would probably not work on without worrying about wasting it. I think there's enough merit to this ability for me to call it pretty good. It's nowhere near how crazy it is in a real game, because we're not talking about Unrelenting, but it's pretty good. Silas's Elder Sign, though, is completely insane. There are only a couple of characters in the game that can say they're better than Harvey and Mandy and Daisy, where they just get to draw cards. The other ones that come to mind immediately being Winifred and Father Mateo. But this Elder Sign is nuts. You may commit a skill card from your discard pile to this test, you're always going to have those, your Silas, and then when the test ends, return it to your hand instead of discarding it. That's wild. His Elder Sign effect is basically a better Practice Makes Perfect, which is one of the best cards in the game. That is absolutely incredible. Unfortunately for Silas, his unique weapons that he comes with have a much harsher weakness, but the abilities that he gets with the alternative set from the promo pack have a way less advantage. So I'm not sure which one I should be rating him on just yet. Let's go through them and see if it becomes clear to me. If you pick the Sea Change Harpoon, you're going to have a 3-cost weapon. It gets +1 fist for the attack, and if you commit skills, which you're Silas, you probably do, it gets +1 damage. And when the test ends, if you want those skills back, you can return all of them to your hand instead of discarding them by returning the Sea Change Harpoon as well. The economy of that, you playing your Sea Change Harpoon a couple times a game, is pretty harsh in Survivor, especially Mono Survivor, but it's manageable. It's an effect that'll happen some amount of the time, and just flat +1 fist, +1 damage as a melee weapon that takes up one hand is really good. It's better than Machete, and we tabooed that to cost experience. Silas's Net is a 2-cost asset that takes up your other hand slot. You evade, you get +1 foot for the evasion attempt. If you commit skills, you can evade a second enemy engaged with you. And when it ends, same effect, you can return it to return all the skills to your hand. I feel like this one might come up more often due to things like Nimble and Quick Thinking being really easy to use on evasion checks. The problem with that being that even though there are more beneficial things that are easier to use on an evasion check, there's also less for Silas to do with it. Like, cool, you moved across the map after you broke that guy's ankles, and you have all 3 actions still. You're the fighter. Walk back over there and kill him, right? I do think that is good. Silas is definitely a fighter that evades enemies a lot of the time, for various reasons. The main one being that he's a mono-red fighter, and doesn't have access to the best weapons. But because he does frequently evade enemies, and when he does, he's frequently committing skills to it, the Silas's Net is almost pure upside, and it's still quite a good card. Siren Call is brutal, though. As a fighter, you don't get to freely pay a 2-action tax whenever you draw this. There will be turns where there are 2 enemies or more on the board, you have to kill them and you draw Siren Call, and you don't have the economy to do this. In the Innsmouth campaign I played alongside of Silas, I, several times, as the flex character in the group, would start my turn by just getting rid of Siren Call so that Silas could fight. Very frequently, this 2-cost tax has to get paid by your teammates and not you, which is fine, and that means it's still a 2-cost tax for the team, but it might be hard for your teammates to bear the burden, since they've already got all of their own problems to deal with. And it does have to leave, and it has to leave immediately, because it has an additional cost to commit any skills to a test. You have to pay 1 resource for every matching skill icon those cards have. Even if that's just one resource per skill, it's still brutal, and it's usually more than that. I think in solo campaigns or two-person campaigns, this weakness is absolutely brutal, but as you get more teammates who can find the time to get rid of it for you, if you need the help to get rid of it, it gets less bad. Alternatively to that, you take nautical prowess. It gives a head, a book, and a wild, so 2 to head or book, 1 to fist or foot. And if you reveal a negative chaos token during this test, you can either draw 1 card or gain 2 more question marks. So that's pretty good. It's either replacing itself and triggering all of the things you need to commit skills to trigger, or it's just going to pass a test that you would have failed. Either way, that's quite good, but it's not particularly insane, especially since taking this is mutually exclusive with taking the harpoon and net. Dreams of the Deep is going to give you -2 question marks, which sucks, and then if you fail the skill test, you put it back in your hand, so you've got to pass it. And if you fail to get rid of it, then you're going to reveal it and take 2 damage at the end of your turn, over and over again until you do get rid of it. I don't see a reason to pick the bottom half. The payoff cards don't pay off like these do, and the weakness, even though it's softer a lot of the time, is also harsher some of the time. And I think the ability to have your teammates help you with your Siren Call is what brings Siren Call into not being that hard. So a quick recap, I think his ability is very good, his Elder Sign is insane, his assets are pretty good, and his weakness is pretty bad, but not the worst. It's just very frequently a 2-action tax that someone has to pay immediately, and especially at lower player counts, that can be very awkward. So where do I put Silas? He's definitely not making it into our S tier. He's somewhere between A and A+, I'm not quite sure just yet. He feels like he's very close to the barrier, that he's in low A+ or very high A. I don't think his weakness holds him back at all. I think it's very awkward, but despite standing out in its awkwardness, it is usually not a meaningful problem. His signature assets aren't like broken or overpowered, but they're good. They're very, very good. They synergize very directly with how Silas wants to play the game. His Elder Sign is absolutely nuts, but it's the least important part of a character, and his ability is more valuable defensively than offensively, generally speaking, but still useful no matter what part of the game we're looking at. I'm going to leave him in low A+. I could see him being high A, but I don't know. Maybe I'm only putting him in A+ because it makes me feel better. I think Silas deserves to be fairly high on the tier list. It's either the top of A, like the very top, or the lowest character in A+, and I'm not quite sure which, but I'm comfortable with where he is for now. Moving on, we have Patrice. Let's see exactly how I feel about her abilities. Your maximal hand size is reduced by 3, which would be brutal, except that during the upkeep phase, instead of drawing 1 card, you discard all non-weakness cards in your hand and draw until you have 5. So that's pretty good. Losing out on max hand size would be unfortunate if you didn't just natively draw 5 cards a turn. That's kind of insane. Her start effect lets you, whenever the test ends, shuffle all but 1 card from your discard pile into your deck. This isn't just to prevent yourself from taking 1 horror later. You can do it because you've either hit your good cards early and you know the best part of your deck is in your discard pile, or because you've already dealt with your signature weakness and you don't want to deal with it again. We'll get to him later. I think her Elder Sign is fine. It's definitely not bad. It helps her with her game plan, but it's not super important, and a lot of the time it's not going to be relevant. Her ability, though, is insane. Her ability does just say draw 5 cards a turn. I think Patrice might make it into my S tier. Not like for this video, she definitely does because this ability is so crazy, but like the actual S tier over the course of all classes where what you're doing is crazy broken, like I was talking about with Stella, that S tier. Because the other 2 cards really can't make this bad. Her violin is actually just really, really good and synergizes directly with her. It's not at all holding her baseline down. She's got a 2-cost hand asset, whereas a lightning bolt, you can choose and discard one of your many expendable cards, exhaust the violin, and then give an investigator at your location a resource and a draw. That's some pretty wild team support, and if you need it for yourself, then it's fine to use for yourself too. Her weakness is a thing you absolutely have to plan around when you make your deck, but it also, provided you don't auto-fail the check against it, should usually not be a problem. It has Revelation, you secretly add it to your hand, and I can fight or evade that enemy while it's in my hand as if it were at my location. If you succeed, discard it from your hand. If you fail, spawn it engaged with you. If your deck runs out of cards while it's in your hand, it attacks you from your hand for 3 meat damage, which is very scary. Based on the rules research I was doing earlier today, I think that if you draw this from the bottom of your deck, like if you have 4 cards left in your deck and you know one of them is the Watcher from another dimension, then since all cards are drawn simultaneously and you have to shuffle your deck to complete the draw, I think that means that Watcher from another dimension doesn't trigger, because you've technically drawn it after you shuffle your deck. If someone can clarify that for me, that'll be important, because it's definitely going to come up whenever I played Patrice, like it's unavoidable. But I think that situation doesn't make it attack you, and I'd like some clarity on that. Regardless though, dealing with this thing has to be planned around. They can always auto-fail and spawn, and then your fighter has to deal with it. If you've got a strong enough fighter, if you're walking around with a Mark Harrigan who's just attacking at 8 or more every turn, this thing only has 2 health. You can just be like, yeah, eventually I'm going to just throw a test at this and fail it as my last action, and then Mark will handle it. That's a solution you can have. But usually the solution you'll have is you'll be using some sort of mystic asset with some combination of skills to evade or fight it at like at least +4, more if there's curses in the bag or you're on a higher difficulty, and provided you don't auto-fail, you discard the guy and he's gone. I think Watcher from Another Dimension, despite being one of the scariest weaknesses on the surface, is incredibly manageable. Like, I have to acknowledge that he forces you to play and deck build differently, that's definitely true. But at the same time, he's not going to be that scary if you do. So with a relatively soft weakness, provided you plan around it, a very good synergistic signature asset, and an absolutely busted ability, I don't think there's any question that Patrice gets to hang out with Stella in the S tier. She's absolutely insane. Dude, I wonder if I'm going to play Patrice and move her up to reflect that. I think the way she plays isn't strong enough to get into the S tier, because I've made that very competitive in my tier list at this point. There are a lot of crazy strong characters that live in A+, and I think Patrice might well be one of them. I don't think in my actual tier list she gets to be an S tier, but on this tier list, I'm not considering is she broken, I'm considering is she more broken than Stella? Is she like vying for first place in terms of broken investigator cards? I think it's hard to say that draw 5 cards a turn isn't better than gain 1 action a turn. Like, draw 5 cards is like 2.5 actions every turn. It's fucking crazy. It's very hard to say that draw 5 cards a turn is worse than gain 1 action a turn if you fail. Draw 5 is just a crazy amount of draw. Her weakness, like Stella's, is largely irrelevant, and her signature asset is nowhere near as good as Stella's. And I think that does push Stella above her, because Stella gets 3 copies of one of the best defensive cards in the game, whereas Patrice just gets some mild team support. I do think Patrice is right behind Stella, though. Her ability is just absolutely nuts. Coming over to Rita Young, she might fare much better on this tier list than she does on the normal tier list, because I don't have to acknowledge her very janky stat line and card pool. As a reaction to evading an enemy, she can either deal 1 damage to that enemy or move to a connecting location. Those things are both upside if you're evading enemies. Dealing 1 damage means you can effectively kill acolytes by evading them, which is always valuable, and getting a free move if it's the sort of enemy that doesn't have Hunter and you just evade forever is pretty good. I don't think it's crazy. Evading tends to just not be the best thing in the game. I think the best use of this ability is to kill acolytes, but that's still decent, and having a lot of upside to evading does make evading more appealing. Her Elder Sign is trash, though. If you get her Elder Sign, you can use her ability more. You can't plan around that. And you can't reliably trigger that early in your turn either, so it's just kind of completely irrelevant. It has some synergies with cards like Catastrophe, but even then you can't reliably trigger the Catastrophe either. So you just end up in a really awkward spot where her Elder Sign really does just say +2. I would say the ability is good, though. The Elder Sign, not so much. I'm Done Running's a 0-cost fast event. You have to play it during your turn. It readies and engages all enemies at your location. For the remainder of your turn, whenever you evade an enemy, instead of exhausting and disengaging from that enemy, you may deal it 1 damage. All other effects of successful evasion still apply. So even though you aren't exhausting or disengaging them, you can still trigger things like Nimble, I guess is what that is specifying. This allows Stella to use her ability in conjunction with this ability to deal 2 damage per evade. if you spend your whole turn evading, that lets you do 6 whole damage. Like, it's a way to deal 6 damage, so it's not nothing. But having a signature asset that lets me, like, take 3 skill tests to deal 6 damage over the course of a turn does not feel super engaging. Like, it's not bad. It's obviously good. It's all upside. But it's just not very good. It's just a weird, janky way to deal damage. And her signature weakness, Hoods, is a 3/3/3 enemy. It's got Alert. After you evade Hoods, it attacks you. So if you evade Hoods and you fail the check, he hits you twice then, because he has Alert and the Forced effect? I've never seen a weakness that just hated you this much. Like, this really does feel like a weakness where you're just like, oh shit. You either play Backstab, shoot with Ornate Bow, or you ask the team's fighter to deal with it, because you don't have an answer. Because this thing is Hunter, too. It's not like it's going to hang out once you evade it, right? Evading this just doesn't help you. It's actively worse than trying to do anything else. Wow, that is an incredibly mean weakness that Rita's just not well equipped to deal with. I will acknowledge that Rita is best played as Flex, and that does mean you should have a fighter who can deal with this. Most people don't have signature weaknesses that demand your fighter come deal with the problem, and most people don't have signature weaknesses that demand a fighter come deal with the problem, while you're a Flex character that said, it's fine, I'm independent, and walked across the map from him. Hoods is incredibly awkward. Holy shit, what a mean weakness. Her signature card really doesn't do a whole lot. Her ability is good, but not amazing. Her Elder Sign is blank. I was hoping I could place Rita like in B tier or higher, but honestly, I'm gonna put her down here beneath Bob. Her ability just isn't very good. It makes evading a little bit better. That's it. Her signature card is incredibly awkward damage dealing. Her signature weakness is absolutely viciously mean considering how Rita plays the game. There's just not a lot of upside about Rita. It doesn't matter if I'm looking at her stat line or her card pool or her abilities. No matter what part of Rita I look at, I'm like, man, I wish this was something else. That's really unfortunate for her. For what it's worth, in my tier list, I have moved Rita up from D tier to the very top of C tier. I think she is a fine investigator and borders on good. But that's largely due to pilfer and backstab abuse, and less to do with anything generally about the character. I see virtually no reason to play Rita over almost any rogue, to be honest. Coming down to our next character, we have Calvin Wright. This is a character where you have to acknowledge what their stat line is because it's very important. It's all zeros, and for every damage or horror on you, you get +1 to the relevant stats. Horror gives you the mental stats, head and book. Physical damage gives you the physical stats, fist and foot. His Elder Sign is very, very good, either allowing you to take direct damage and horror to come online faster, or to heal damage or horror, making you safe in the late game when things have gotten a little bit out of control. The stat growth when you take damage is insane, but it has to be measured under the assumption that you start with zeros, because if you ignore that and assume you have a stat line with 12, this is like the best investigator in the game. But you have a stat line of 0. So this gives you very high stats in every stat, but it takes a while to get there. That's good. The setup time is costly, but it is very, very good. Provided you can be safe with your health very low, that you have a way to deal with direct damage and a lot of soak for non-direct damage, this is really good. I think a lot of the problem with Calvin comes from his mono-red card pool, making it very hard to get action compression, and the mandatory cards that Calvin runs to keep himself alive, confining his deck building a lot. But at an ability level, I think the setup is easily worth the payoff. The problem gets into when you're building the deck and trying to fit all the cards you want into a Calvin deck, you can feel very, very restricted. But I think his ability is great. It's not quite broken. The setup time is pretty severe. It might not even be A+, but it's definitely at least like the top of A. And his Elder Sign is fantastic for its direct synergy with it. Until the End of Time is a fantastic signature for Calvin. It's a 1-cost talent that gives you 2/2 soak that can be used for direct damage and horror. That's very good. It is a card that makes Calvin safe completely to direct damage and horror without relying on something like Talisman of Protection. I'm pretty confident that Voice of the Messenger is the only weakness in the game that's upside. When you draw it, you take either direct damage or horror. That doesn't matter. You can play around that. Just leave yourself with 1 horror or damage to spare. And in addition, you take an associated trauma, which is going to help you come online faster in future scenarios. This can deal up to 7 trauma to you over the course of a campaign. Calvin can only afford to take 10 before he dies. So if you're playing a campaign with additional trauma like Forgotten Age, you might not want to take in the thick of it. You might just be afraid of dying to trauma if you do that. So you need to consider things like that. But outside of that, it's just all upside. I think Calvin's very good. I think all of his weakness stems from the difficult deck building that he has. Because you need a bunch of powerful cards like Jessica Hyde and Pete Sylvester. You need a bunch of the cards that Calvin has access to that just feel like you can't justify cutting them, like Ward level 2 and Stand Together level 3, which are some of the best cards in the game. And then you need whatever cards it is that are for your role, and by the end of it, you're looking at like a 28-ish card deck that you would like to have before you feel like you've made any choices. The deck building for Calvin is super restrictive, and that really hurts him a lot, but that's not what we're talking about today. We're talking about what his ability does. And it feels a little bit unfair to exclude the deck building constraints it's going to impose on you, but that's how I'm going to rate it. His weakness is actually good. His signature asset is very good for the playstyle that he has. His ability gives him the best stat line in the game with 5s across the board. And there are cards that let you do that very safely. There are cards like the 5 of Pentacles that let you even get more than 5s across the board. This gets into a way I talk about the game that I don't see happening very often. Action compression is worth more than stats. Unexpected Courage is my least favorite card in the game because it's just giving you stats. All the other neutral skills are drawing you cards, and Unexpected Courage just helps you with the test. That's the price it pays for its versatility. But coming to Calvin, he's just stats. He offers no action compression. You look at everyone up here and as an A+, even Silas, they're getting action compression, drawing 5, gaining an action, recurring his skills. They're all doing something that generates positive value. Calvin just has stats. That's not bad, and he has a shitload of stats. But if he can't get action compression from his deck, then he doesn't have it. And spoiler alert, he basically can't get action compression from his deck. It's one of the weaknesses of a red card pool. Which means that, unfortunately, I don't think Calvin is particularly broken. Getting high stats is valuable, at least in Standard. Calvin's borderline unplayable on higher difficulties where your stat line matters less. It's very normal for a Calvin in Standard to be like, I've taken 5 horror, I have Pete in play, I have 6 head, I'm safe to the Mythos deck. And if you do that on a high difficulty, you're just going to keep taking horror and die eventually. You're going to pull -5s, -6s, -8s, whatever it is, and you're going to die. You're not going to be safe because of your Calvin stat line. I do rank these around Standard and 2 to 3 player multiplayer, though, so that's not a problem for us. But his stat line is just all he is. And it's a good stat line. It's a great stat line. But without action compression, I can't even put him in A+, unfortunately. Will Yorick has the reaction ability to, after you defeat an enemy, play an asset from your discard pile, paying its cost limit once per round. That's absolutely sick. There are a bunch of cards in the game where you can easily discard them by getting value from them and then recur them with this ability. The 0-cost Red Soak, Beat Comps, there's a lot of options here for things that will go into your discard pile and then come back for recursive value. I don't get to talk about Short Supply and Will Yorick in this video, but I will mention that it's there and that I'm not considering it the value of his ability. His ability is very good, though. It's not broken, and I don't think it's quite excellent, but it is great. It is very, very good. His star effect is sick. Not only do you get +2, but if you succeed, return a card from your discard pile to your hand. With 3s in his defensive stats, there's almost no Mythos test in the game that gives you a difficulty of 6. That means his Elder Sign on any Mythos test basically is going to pass you and then get you a card from your discard pile, which there are plenty of cards there that you can't recur with your ability. That only gets you assets. You can't get things back like Stand Together or Vicious Blow. So his Elder Sign is absolutely fantastic. Bury Them Deep is absolutely sick. 0-cost event, when you kill a non-elite enemy, put them in the victory display, add this card with them, get victory 1 at the end of the scenario. We at my table have just banned Delve Too Deep. Originally, we banned it, but we took 1 experience a scenario because we hated playing with it, and as we got more experience with the game, we're like, the game's not balanced around Delve Token. The game is not balanced around the idea that you're generating extra experience every scenario. Delve Too Deep is just strictly a thing that good players can do to break the game because they're able to deal with the weaknesses Delve Too Deep incurs. And Bury Them Deep is, as it turns out, just another copy of Delve Too Deep. The game's not balanced around this. If you walk out of the campaign with 7 more experience than you should have in the finale, it's going to be very valuable. And it turns out that if you're playing a 4-player campaign and Yorick gives your team a net total of 28 experience by the end of the campaign, that's going to do a lot of work in the final scenario. So yeah, Bury Them Deep is gross. We have banned Delve Too Deep at my table, and this is literally just Delve Too Deep, but better. Graveyard Ghouls is a 3/3/2 hunter enemy that's going to spawn engaged with you. While it's engaged with you, your cards cannot leave your discard pile, so you need to kill him first if you want to use your ability. You can't kill the other enemy that might have been a higher priority if this guy spawned at an inopportune time. But I mean, let's be real. Most of the time with Graveyard Ghouls, he shows up and you're like, oh, hey, thanks for the teddy bear, dude. You spend your time beating him to death with a melee weapon, and then you get something out of your graveyard, and it's not even a problem that he showed up. So where am I placing Bull Yorick? I'm putting him above Calvin for sure. I'm putting him at the top of A tier at least. His ability to recur stuff from his graveyard is pretty fair, but also very good. His Elder Sign is sick, but it's the least important part of a character. Delve Too Deep as your ability. Delve Too Deep, but better, puts him above Silas. He's higher in A+ than Silas. I cannot overstate this enough. The game is not balanced around additional experience for your whole party. Green characters are to a degree balanced around Karen's Opal. Purple characters are to a degree balanced around arcane research and down the rabbit hole. But campaigns as a whole are not balanced around stapling on 1 extra experience to every scenario, which is what Delve Too Deep does, and it's what Bury Them Deep does. And it's only now that I'm saying that out loud over and over again that I realize if there's ever another experience card printed, it's going to end in Deep. We've set a theme here. I think I put Yorick like somewhere in the middle of A+ tier. I can easily see several people going above him, but I think with just how generally great everything he's doing is, combined with stapling Delve Too Deep onto a red character, and also potentially being really good. Like, Yorick usually isn't removing super threatening enemies with that card, but there are a lot of finales with big and non-elite enemies that cycle their Mythos decks very quickly, and removing one of those from the game is actually really helpful. So I think Yorick is just excellent. If Yorick has any weaknesses, they stem from his card pool and his stat line, but those are also pretty solid, and if anything, might make him better than I'm giving him credit for here. Coming down to our next character, we have Ashcan Pete. His signature asset starts in play, it's Duke, and as a lightning bolt, you can discard a card from hand to ready an asset you control once per round. The Elder Sign is +2 Ready Duke. So let's talk about Duke, because Ashcan Pete is really more Duke than Ashcan Pete. Duke, the Loyal Hound, is a 2-cost asset. You won't have to pay this unless he dies, and you have to find a way to get him back. You can exhaust him to fight or investigate. Either way, you do it with a base skill of 4. If you fight, you deal 2 damage for the attack. If you're investigating, you may move to a connecting location immediately before investigating with this effect. That last line, you may move to a connecting location immediately before investigating with this effect, is the reason that Ashcan Pete's actually a very good investigator. The number of actions you get from Duke investigate checks is actually really, really high. Using Duke to fight feels terrible, and you investigate with the base skill of 4, but honestly, you're probably putting a bunch of static book bumps in your deck and could have investigated by yourself. The +2 to the investigate check on Duke is not that relevant compared to the move. It's very nice, especially early in a campaign when you have a lower book stat, but that free move, it's not quite take a free action every turn, because sometimes you're going to have to fight an Acolyte or a Rat with Duke, and sometimes you're not going to be able to move this turn, but it is very close to a free move action every turn. It's absolutely crazy. It does give you 2/3 soak, but considering you start with 6/5 soak, that balances out to the same amount of soak that everyone else has. If you're willing to kill Duke, which you should never do, you'll have 1 more soak than a normal character, but if you're not willing to do that, you'll have the same soak as any normal non-Dunwich investigator. So let's come back and reevaluate what this does. You begin with Duke in play. Good, because your stats are trash, your soak is trash, you need Duke. As a lightning bolt, you can discard a card from hand to ready Duke. That's absolutely fantastic. You can actually ready something other than Duke. There's a very rarely a good reason to do this, but you can build decks where that comes into play. Readying Duke is frequently really, really good. It's going to give you a free move action again, probably. That's probably the reason you're doing it. But it's also going to discard a card from hand, which in Ashcan Pete, as a red character, there are a lot of cards that want to be discarded that are very good in him. Elder Sign, Ready Duke, that's going to do nothing a lot of the time. Like probably about 50% of the time, you get the Elder Sign, it does nothing. You get it like during the Mythos phase, or on some test you had to make before you move with Duke, and then it does nothing. And a lot of the time, you're going to use Duke, and your turn's over, and readying Duke's not going to do anything. But I'd say about half the time, this readies Duke and does something meaningful. Even if it's just +2 buck to a check, that's not nothing. But some of the time, that's going to be a free move action. It's very good. Ashcan Pete is one of those characters with a really obnoxious 2-action tax card as his weakness. It exhausts all of your assets, and they cannot ready. That means no Duke, no nothing, and there are a lot of assets that have uses that Ashcan Pete makes use of where you wanted to be able to exhaust them, and this stops you. This basically kills one of your turns, but as either the flex character or the clover in a group, you're never going to be in a situation where you can't just deal with this and be sad about a largely lost turn. So he has an obnoxious but ultimately quite soft weakness, an incredible permanent asset that he's built around, and it's not permanent, you can lose Duke. I've lost Duke. Sometimes you start the campaign, you don't draw any of your soak, you autofail multiple rotting remains, and Duke just dies. That's just how it is sometimes. But the vast majority of the time, Duke is going to be alive the whole campaign. He's basically a permanent card. Oh, and I should mention, Duke does not take up an ally slot. He is an ally asset, but he doesn't take up the slot. That's very important. He'd be much, much worse if he forced you to buy charismas to use allies. And then, even if you were doing that, you'd still be down an ally slot compared to where you should have been. But he doesn't have those penalties. So where do I place Ashcan? I guess I should say, where do I place Duke? Because everything I just talked about was all about Duke. Does he make it into S tier? His ability is a free action ability. That's why Duke is so good. His weakness is relatively soft. I'm trying to find an argument to put Ashcan into S tier. I've been sitting here silently for a while thinking about how I could justify it, and I really can't. He is absolutely sick because of the free movement from Duke. But ultimately, that's pretty much all he gets. He gets to abuse it a little bit more than that because of his Elder Sign and his ability. But it's usually pretty hard to take 2 meaningful free moves in the same turn unless you're playing in true solo. He's very good, though. I think if I were doing a true solo tier list, I'd be putting him in the top of my S tier. But since I'm doing this for 2 to 4 player multiplayer, I do think he has to hang out in my A+ ranks. He is the tippy top of it, though. He's very good. So where do I place Wendy Adams? Well, she's going to be somewhere in S tier. Let's go figure out where. Wendy Adams has the ability, as a reaction when you reveal a Chaos token, choose and discard a card from your hand, cancel that Chaos token, return it to the bag, and reveal a new one at limit once per test or ability. That ability is absolutely insane. You're in red, there are plenty of cards that want to be discarded, and even if they didn't want to be discarded, re-rolling the token on huge impactful tests like Pilfer or Backstab is just really good. Even if you're just re-rolling a token where you're testing it up to on a dangerous Mythos card, that's still really good. Wendy's ability is absolutely insane. It is the most powerful defensive ability in the game, and with certain cards, the most powerful offensive ability as well. So of course, to balance this out, her Elder Sign is completely blank. +0, if Wendy's Amulet is in play, you succeed instead. Wendy's Amulet is a 2-cost asset. You may play the topmost event in your discard pile as if it were in your hand. I shouldn't acknowledge there's been an advanced version of these put into play. I'll talk about them once I've covered Abandoned and Alone as well. It also has the forced effect after you play an event or discard an event from play, place it on the bottom of your deck instead of in your discard pile. So anytime you're discarding cards with your ability or playing events from your hand, they'll be going on the bottom of your deck instead of your discard pile to prevent you from double dipping where you play an event and then immediately replay the event from your discard pile. It's still absolutely stupidly powerful. There's a lot of shenanigans you could get into with crazy pseudo-infinite stuff using black markets or easy marks towards the end of the game. But even barring that, you still just get an absolute load of power from replaying all the events you played over the course of the game. Abandoned and Alone is a brutal weakness. It doesn't just deal 2 direct horror to you, it's going to remove all cards in your discard pile from the game, which will directly interfere with your Wendy's Amulet plans. I'll now mention that there are advanced versions of these, which I think you should always be playing in Wendy. The advanced abandoned alone is going to deal with redirect horror, and it's not going to remove weaknesses from your discard pile. Both of those are relatively minor changes. Weaknesses staying in your discard pile shouldn't matter much because Wendy's not going to shuffle her deck. And taking one more horror is rough, but you are already taking two. The additional one horror is not going to be the breaking point. Just run a Pete and try not to die to horror damage. The upgraded Wendy's amulet is much more powerful because it's going to let you play the events in your discard pile in any order you want as opposed to topmost first. That lets you do things like more easily stack all your easy marks together. It lets you do things like play your economy cards that are beneath your pilfers and your backstabs, because originally you played them before those cards to afford to play them, and going top down, you wouldn't be able to do that, and your economy gets really janky. I think they're easily worth running for that advantage compared to just taking one more horror and having weaknesses in your discard pile. And I think Wendy's amulet is absolutely disgustingly strong. This just says draw every event you put in your deck, and it turns out they were in your deck for a reason. That's super powerful. Meanwhile, her ability to just not call autofail, just like, no, I didn't autofail, what are you talking about, is absolutely stupid. Taking 3 direct horror from your weakness and having a blank star does suck, but it's not the end of the world. So where do I put Wendy Adams? We all know she's going in S tier. Do I think that what she's doing manages to compete with Patrice and Stella? Built-in immunity to the autofail token, combined with a signature card that says draw every event you've played this game, like that's not quite what it says, but it's basically what it says, are both really insane. I like how I started this video by saying that Stella is one of like 3 characters I thought had tremendously broken abilities in this game, up there with Winifred and Gloria. And then I looked through the rest of the survivors and was like, oh yeah, Patrice and Wendy are a little bit crazy, aren't they? Because they're both like right there with Stella. Wendy's ability is absolutely insane. I just forgot how good she was when I was saying that. And Patrice, I didn't realize how much of my opinion about her is based on her stat line and her deck building. And even then, I might be underestimating her. Her ability is just comically strong. Going back to the previous tier list I've made, you can see something really interesting, which is that green is heavily clustered around the high end of great to excellent, with a couple of outliers. Tony's broken, Chinny's only good, and Skids wants money that he doesn't have, so that's a slight problem. Getting rid of Seekers, you can see that I put most of them into broken, and it's kind of just like tapering off downward from there towards good. But even that said, maybe Rex and Harvey maybe compete with those 3 broken survivors, but most of the broken stuff in the Seeker tier list doesn't actually stand up to the broken stuff in the Rogue tier list. And with Guardians, we had a pretty healthy spread between good and A+, with some outliers in S and A. But with all 3 of these tier lists, you can see the Guardians are weighted heavily in this region. The same thing is true for the Rogues, but slightly higher up with more outliers. And that Seekers were weighted heavily towards the top end of us being absolutely amazing. But then we come over to the Survivor tier list, and not only are they heavily weighted towards the top end of amazing, these S tier survivors are all comparably strong to or better than Rex. The amount of broken that these S tier survivors are cannot be overstated. Their abilities and signatures are absolutely insane. It's just interesting for me to see how many survivors are not just at the top of the tier list, but dominantly like at the top of S tier. To the point where if I did make a combined tier list for everyone's abilities, which I'll probably do in a summary video coming soon, I think I'd have to move a lot of my S tier investigators down into A+, and a lot of my A+ investigators down into A, until we've like tapered off into reasonable groups of power. Because I think I've ranked a lot of characters in S that probably don't compare to Wendy, Stella, and Patrice. They're just absolutely crazy. And that makes a lot of sense to me, because generally speaking, I feel like survivors as a card pool kind of struggle. They don't have great access to action compression, and their stat lines as well tend to just not be that good. Like, you look at Wendy, and it's like 4-4 defensively, that's sick, but her only proactive stat that's usable is a 3 in book. You look at Stella Clark, best abilities in the game, arguably 2 in book, 3 in fist. Mono red card pool. Survivors tend to have really, really strong abilities, but their card pool and their stat lines are what hold them down from greatness. with the exception of Bob, I think every single character in this tier list underperforms in a real game compared to what you're seeing when you just analyze the investigators themselves. The best part about survivors is their abilities, and that really does check out. Because more so than any other class, every survivor is different. Every survivor looks at their ability and builds a deck around that ability that no other survivor could use. And that's really, really cool to see how well this reflects that. I think this is the video where, after doing my analysis, I have the most appreciation for how different their abilities are compared to their actual power levels. Usually they hover pretty close, especially like over the course of a tier list, there'll only be a couple outliers. But almost this entire tier list is up at least a tier compared to where I'd expect them to be at the end of a tier list. I don't think Stella is an S tier character. I don't even think Patrice is an A+ character. I want Ashcan to be an A+ character, but I have him in the top of A, and I feel like that's where he deserves to live. I have Silas in very low A+, so I guess he ended up right in the same spot. I keep fluctuating between Yorick at the top of A+ and the top of A, so he's close to where he should be. But I'm never putting Calvin in A tier, and Rita Young is staying in C tier. So Bob Jenkins is like the only person moving up, and then even characters that are staying in their tier like Wendy tend to move down in that tier. It's just really cool to me to see, with survivors specifically, just how much they tend to be about their abilities as opposed to their stat lines and their deck building. Anyways, I'm pretty sure I'm starting to ramble on, so I'm going to call it now. I've been rather incoherent. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more content just like this, then feel free to subscribe and leave a like. Both of those things really help the channel grow. I'll be dropping the Mystic analysis tomorrow, probably, but very soon, definitely. And I'll see you in the next one.